didn't want to do. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics today. Joe Moore here, joined by Victoria Litman, uh, M.Div, JD, LL.M. So quite the credential set. Thanks for joining me, Victoria.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So you just wrote a interesting article for Cato Institute called "The Future of Regulation is Local." Can you give us like a high level of what you were trying to accomplish there?
I guess just a reminder that federal government has never led the way on smart psychedelic policy. I think they reached out to me or smart drug policy. They reached out to me and said, "Hey, the FDA denied MDMA assisted therapy last summer. People are interested in it. What do you have to say about it?" And my response was, "Who cares? Not who cares, but that's not where the action is. That's not what I'm excited about. I'm excited about state reform. I think that's where real access is happening and will happen." Yeah, and I was developing this idea around like, well, what if we just were able to sell mushrooms in cannabis dispensaries? Wouldn't that be an easy path forward? So I kind of put that at the end of this article.
That would be a pretty nice starting point, right? Like, I remember chatting with Rick Doblin a bunch of years ago, and he was pushing that kind of, I think what Allison Hoots is kind of working on in New York a little bit, but the Tim Leary pilot's license model, right? Where you take a little bit of training and then you can be a card carrying mushroom holder and buy them at legal dispensaries, which is, a step above what's happening in cannabis, but also and I pushed back because I was like, there's a little bit of classism and racism there. Like, who can really afford that time? And it's not necessarily the people that need it the most, right? But I was like, okay, maybe I can tolerate this if it's transitional. Like, we just move toward like, how do we get culture up to speed after this $1 trillion spend on war on drugs, um, and then catch up. But so how, like, do you think, like, I like this as a proposal because we have a number of states selling cannabis. Like, is it more than half are selling recreational or sorry, adult use cannabis now?
I think
Yeah.
it's 20. More than 20 selling adult use, more than 40 selling some form.
Yeah. Great. Um, I was making jokes at psychedelic science. We have 51 states. I was kind of joking about Greenland recently,
I
but
thought you were joking
you
about
know,
Canada. I'm like, who do we know? What do we?
phew,
Oh God.
no, I won't go there yet.
Oh
Poor
God.
people. Poor us, poor them.
Yeah.
But
Right.
so like, um, yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Like it's really clear the public is not okay with, generally speaking, putting people in prison or cages for cannabis. Um, it's becoming increasingly clear that people, once they get educated, watch a couple TV shows or read a book or two, they're like, oh yeah, we shouldn't be putting people in cages for mushrooms either. And really, we shouldn't be putting people in cages for any drugs, but that's not where we're at yet. And do you think there's some sort of like what do you think got us here towards mushrooms? Is it just kind of the clinical literature, the pollen effect, Oprah kind of like getting on board recently, or
Man, what got us here? I mean,
so
in
much?
terms of like shifting to widespread normalization, I do think the pollen effect is pretty real. Just in terms of like, um, you know, people that aren't otherwise in the field, like accepting it as a normal um, part of culture. But I mean, also, I mean, if we're being, honest, what got us here is people continuing to use these substances even when they were criminalized and talking about them. I mean, they're still criminalized in majority of the country, so let's be real. But the ongoing use, right? The belief in their potential, the ability to access them, the fact that some of them are growing, naturally occurring out in nature, um, like that is what got us here. And I mean, I guess pay homage to the substances themselves, right? Like we wouldn't be talking about them in this way. I think about that with cannabis too, where there's still like so much fear around even cannabis, but I mean, there's widespread use in a majority of the country, right? Like if there were serious harms widespread from use, we would see them because there is widespread use.
Right, right. The data set is still being developed, really. I think, yeah, but if we start with the David Nutt harm scale from what, '09, no, I don't even remember my times anymore. I think it was 2010 that came out in the Lancet. The harms are quite low in that study. I think that study needs to be redone and updated, but like I think largely these things are pretty safe. Um, at the very least, in my opinion, safer than alcohol. And like I think that's a major win for me, like personally. Psychedelics have helped me radically reduce, if not totally eliminate alcohol from my diet. And I think that's a net win for me, in a lot of ways. And my doctor would agree, I think, most of the time. Yeah, and I think maybe culture's catching on. I think there's a trend. You've probably seen this too. A trend with like Gen Z and even just drinking nationwide. Like alcohol sales are way down, and they continue to decline. And I think it's a function of health. I think it's a function of Gen Z going, I just don't know that that's the thing I want. Um, right. So we're seeing multiple culture shifts at the same time. Have you seen anything interesting there to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I even just the other night, like after Oklahoma City won the NBA finals, there was all this commentary about how I guess it's a young team. I'm not like an OKC fan, but that there was all this alcohol just sitting around that none of them were drinking, that all of them were like clumsily opening up their champagne bottles and like didn't know how to do it because none of them I mean, that resonates with me. Like for me, drinking is like a something I did inappropriately in college and it, like I really haven't done since. Meaning like I was, you binge drink in college because that's the culture. But by the end of college, I was kind of like, wow, this makes me feel horrible. And there's all these other alternatives that actually enhance my life. Um, so I certainly think we're seeing that. I mean, on the danger thing, I think it is all relative. And unfortunately, what I'm about to say is just like true with our country. But, when you compare it to like guns or opioid overdoses, fentanyl overdoses, or alcohol, alcohol causing cancer. And I think that also has really led to this shift where there's all this research and data, which is not new to, people I think that have been paying attention to drug and addiction. Like the idea that alcohol is a leading cause of cancer is not, surprising because of how it affects our cells. But that data has been really publicized this past year or two. I've been hearing more and more. And I think people are, you're right, like health motivated.
Yeah, I remember the. I keep forgetting about that cancer angle. For whatever reason, try to push it aside. But yeah, you're right.
Because
This
it's
is
sad. It's really sad because a lot of people drink a lot and alcohol is very normalized as part of our culture. I mean, I just get myself, like you go places and the idea that like people would be handing out edibles is like, but they're like handing out cancer drinks, and no one wants to be the one to say that. But I think people are, I know more and more people that are, it's not that I'm like, oh, I'm sober. I just like don't drink because it makes me feel horrible. It's like
right.
not a,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. The cancer, I just kind of push that up to the side. But yeah, I feel horrible most of the time. The real cause for me was like I just can't even sleep anymore after one or two drinks. I'm just done. I'm like, okay, I prioritize sleep. Well, let's start talking about like okay, psychedelic liberalization at the state level. Like we've seen a lot of municipal level things, but Oregon was kind of a leader in this. It's tragic too because they had this really amazing other bill that decriminalized everything with very poor implementation. Sometimes I think it was a little criminal how they tried to not implement it, but also, it was a leading bill. It was a good try, but resistance is everywhere. So, what kind of observations did you make about Oregon and like the Oregon people's interest in kind of a psychedelic liberalization towards this regulated model, at least?
Well, I'll just say on the Measure 310, which was the all drug decrim model, um, I think that, and this is something that I think is worth saying when we're talking about whether, regulated psychedelic models, all psychedelic models, psychedelics in general, especially when you're looking at headlines from, high up political officials who are like, we're going to, cure the world's trauma. In other words, they maybe don't say that as explicitly as others in our field by legalizing psychedelics. That I think with measure with uh, Oregon drug decriminalization. Sorry, my brain is waking up. Um, there was this idea, like the reason why it was repealed is, people were homeless, homelessness increased, and poverty increased, and it was during the pandemic. So some of it's implementation, some of it's bad timing, but I think a lot of it is also like unrealistic expectations about what drug reform can do. And I don't think drug reform, no matter whether we do it through this decrim model or we do it through um, uh, a facilitated use model, or we do it through a decrim type model in Colorado or a total decrim model, right? It's not going to like solve drug addiction. It's not going to solve poverty. It's not going to solve homelessness. It's not going to solve the root causes of mental health issues. Um, uh, I think I said it was 310. It's 110 and 109. My brain is like, waking up. I taught psychedelic log late last night. I'm teaching this little evening class, and I'm like, oh yeah, well we just talked about these measures in my class, which is great. But in terms of the regulated model, I mean, I think it's the same thing. Like if you're going to create a limited on-site consumption regulated model, like Oregon did with the Psilocybin Services Act, meaning you can only use psilocybin if you're using it on-site with the facilitator at a psilocybin services center. The expectation is not going to be widespread access, right? That's not a model that equals widespread access. That's a model that's like a corporate exemption, access for people who can afford it and who have the time to do it in that way model, which I think I say in this article that we, is the premise for this conversation, right? That we've learned a lot about this facilitated use model, that it's really hard, especially when we have federal illegality. So we have punitive taxes, we have banking challenges, we have insurance challenges, right? I know that there have been people who've been helped by psilocybin services in Oregon. I think it's a cool example. But myself, I'm much more excited about the Colorado, Massachusetts proposal, Alaska proposal model. And I think this goes back to what, Joe and I were talking about even before we jumped on, that I think there should be multiple points of access. And so for some people, the like on-site consumption, limited access model is what I would call that, is what they want, is what they need.
Right.
And not for everyone.
The punitive tax thing is huge. Can you, since you have a great tax background, can you kind of like break down what that looks like for folks?
Sure. I like to say when I talk about tax, I'm like, I'm gonna try and make it fun, try and make it interesting. People get scared of tax. Generally, businesses, like in Schitt's Creek, when the main character, like the son, is like, it's a write-off. I'm just gonna write it off. It doesn't exist. Like I wrote it off, right? Like he's talking about business deductions. This idea that like you make income from a business and instead of paying taxes on it, he doesn't quite understand it. So I'm gonna explain it. But that's what he's trying to talk about. If you reinvest money into a business, whether that's, paying the salaries of your employees, paying the rent for your building, paying for your mic equipment, whatever. If you're a podcaster, then you can take that deduction from your income and you're not going to pay tax on that. And the idea is, well, one, we want people to reinvest money in their business. So if you're making money and you're going to reinvest in your business, good. We want that. That like stimulates growth and possible profit. And also you don't have that money anymore because you reinvested it in your business. So you made money and then you said, I'm going to take some of that money and put it back in my business. So I don't have that money anymore. So I can't pay taxes on that money because I don't have it anymore. Income Section 280E, right, which is a federal tax law that was passed prior to state legalization of drugs in the early 80s in response to a tax court ruling. It's actually a really funny case. I mean, if you're a nerd, but if you like drugs too, this guy was illegally selling amphetamines and marijuana and whatever. And, the IRS says you're supposed to report illegal income. And this guy said, okay, I'm going to report my little scale and my little baggies that I'm going to package up my drugs in. And I'm going to report the mileage for transporting my drugs interstate. And the tax court said, okay, those are business deductions for your illegal business. And we want you to report your illegal income. And so you can take those deductions because, again, you don't have that money. You invested it in your illegal business. But Congress wasn't very happy about that. So they passed 280E because they said, hey, that's basically incentivizing people to have illegal drug businesses. And we are big on the war on drugs. And so it was this like punitive tax policy that's like, okay, if you're going to sell illegal drugs, you're going to pay taxes, but we're going to tax you to death, basically. We're going to make you pay taxes on any money you make, even if you reinvest it in your business. And then when legal cannabis came on the scene about a decade or so later, they realized that these cannabis businesses were also subject to this punitive tax. It applies to Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs. Cannabis right now is Schedule 1, all psychedelics except for ketamine Schedule 1. So this has been interpreted over time to mean like if you have a legal business under state law, but you're engaging in commercial sales, that you are subject to this punitive tax rate, right? And in practice in the cannabis industry, this is like a 70% tax rate. So most businesses owe a huge amount of money to the IRS. And with psychedelics, we're just starting to kind of see how this plays out. I know there's some great tax lawyers. At Psychedelic Science 2 years ago, I did a workshop on this kind of tax issue with some of the other tax lawyers in Oregon and Colorado. So there's some possibility for creative tax planning to try and mitigate this burden, but it is a huge challenge in the cannabis world for constitutional law reasons. You can deduct the cost of inventory, like the cost of goods sold, meaning like anything that is part of growing the cannabis can be deducted, which is kind of crazy. Or like you can't deduct the bud tender, but you can deduct the pot. But that's just some weird technicality. But in psychedelics, we're not selling goods, we're selling services. So that makes it harder. So there's even less you can deduct in psychedelics. So there's been some attempts at creative tax planning. Tax audits take time to play out. So we'll kind of see what that looks like in the next couple of years, I think. But there are some great tax lawyers trying to work on it. But you're trying to like put a Band-Aid on like a huge gushing, bleeding wound here. So yeah, I mean, that's like the 280E 101, but that's why one of the reasons I'm so excited about the personal use side of Colorado, because if you're not a state regulated business who's tracking all your state regulated sales, you're not going to be subject to 280E.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think one thing I regularly think about in these state models, and I find it complicated, is this concept around um, the balance between this weird tax situation at the federal level and also kind of high levels of regulation, making it additionally expensive to stay compliant and to offer these services. So, like, let's kind of name it, right? Like, these services are very expensive. You kind of mentioned some people can access it, and that's it. There's cost. It's a substantial cost. And I think it shouldn't be all the way cheap because you want quality people, but it shouldn't be expensive to the degree that you can't, like, the average person can't afford it. I would love to see everybody to be able to afford it. This is kind of why I'm on this kind of end the drug war maximalization thing, and how do we create communities of practice and all that kind of stuff. So, what is there anything in your perspective in Colorado and Oregon that looks like overly burdensome from the regulatory compliance angle that like could make this stuff more accessible? Just say when New Mexico or Alaska try to roll out their regulated use portions, like what might they learn from these two states?
Man, that's a good question. I mean, my initial thought is like the on-site consumption piece, but on the other hand, you want people to have a safe place to use it. I know that Alaska's proposal actually does allow for at-home use, which is, I think, a huge step forward. I know in Oregon, there was recently a lawsuit around like disability accommodations for people in hospice care, where they could use at home. Um,
There was
man,
Colorado had a couple exemptions recently for at home, but it was originally supposed to be at home, but the um, let's say regulators and government chose to not follow the will of the people on that one.
I think also, I mean, another big question mark for me and in general is like, and there's, I mean, I have some work coming out on this. I've already published a bit on like psychedelic chaplaincy, but this question of like, who is a facilitator? How should they be regulated? Like, I know for some of these states, the like requirement that the facilitator licenses get also approved by like the higher ed commission is like burdensome. The cost of these facilitator programs can be very expensive, and they don't necessarily translate between states. And then I know historically in Oregon, though it's changing, if you were like a medical professional, you couldn't like use that to provide psychedelic services. Like there's this, like you have to get an additional certification, and like in Oregon initially, like a separate location. And I know in Colorado there's this like clinical license type. So but I just think like as much as we can like integrate psychedelics into existing infrastructure. I mean, I think that's my like psychedelic dispensary model idea. That would be less burdensome. But I mean, also I think about like burdensome on the state, right? So we were talking about this too, like before we hopped on with Massachusetts. I think one of the reasons that Massachusetts didn't really have the appetite for, a Colorado style proposal, besides like misinformation and not enough education amongst voters, is just this idea that we're going to invest a lot of state resources in setting up an entirely new regulatory body So, I mean, in Oregon, it was under the Oregon Health Authority, but the Massachusetts proposal, I mean, just like the amount of money, I mean, even in Oregon, even though it was under the Oregon Health Authority, it cost taxpayers money, right? They were taking money away from other areas because before you start making money, you have to be able to fund the like startup costs, fund the employees of the agency, fund the regulatory process, which can take like years before you actually get rules and licensing applications and businesses standing up. So I think, you know, when I think about the burden, I think about that burden, and it just makes it like not that palatable for voters, but also for state officials to say, oh, like, especially right now, I mean, we can like name it. There's like the politics of it all, but there's also the practical like economics of it, where our federal government is defunding like, you know, mass amounts of state institutions,
Mm-hmm.
schools, libraries, nonprofits, right? Like most states are not in a financial position to absorb that loss. So the idea that states are then going to turn around and invest a bunch of money in a like essentially experimental model that may or may not make money for them. I feel like that is an area where, I mean, if the voters vote for it, then the legislature has to implement it, and that gets like sticky and dicey. But I think that all contributes to the, you know, not as successful as it could be model.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so, for example, for those who aren't too, yeah, I guess everybody isn't. I haven't shared this too widely. Like, you know, we operate psychedelics today because we can sell education, right? And we were not able to, I guess, cross the Rubicon in both Oregon and Colorado for training programs. And like our program is this close to being like exactly what is needed. And the financial expense and the competitive nature of the landscape just made it such that I could not justify entering, even though my students wanted it real bad. And you know, I in a lot of ways, like I don't know that I would have felt good selling them into a regulated access model because it's, you know, it's a highly competitive. What I've heard in Colorado recently is if you've made it through a training program, unless you're also a clinician, service centers aren't wanting to hire you to work there, and that's that's a very additionally extreme burden. But it's like based on, it's not necessarily regulators, right? It's insurance, I guess, which trickles down from regulation. So like it's cheaper to only hire clinicians because of your insurance. Like, insurance is barely worked out yet here too, which is a huge burden on the business. So it's complicated. And yeah, the portability between states would have been amazing. I think that would have been something that who New Approach HAF could have thought about more deeply as they're kind of funding a lot of these state programs. So yeah, was there anything else that seemed like super burdensome on the local side, or can we jump over to the feds?
Hmm. Um, I think I'm ready to go with the feds. I'll think about it, see if
Ah,
something else pops up.
yeah, great. So on the federal side, right, we have these this highly scheduled compounds are now getting liberalized at the state level. So we have this, you know, 280E thing, but we also have like our like there's no signal yet that the federal agencies are going to come after these regulated service models. But it's not like we didn't see this in cannabis, right? California was, you know, getting swamped by federal enforcement regularly. Even after I think I remember something really fun where it was a former California governor pretty much saying if feds come in to do this, we're going to arrest you. Which I think we're seeing again recently with ICE, which is lovely. But also, like, I think it's it's an interesting concern, and we've seen it in the religious use case, right? Like, ostensibly, we have freedom to practice religion, but I've I know people who have been arrested in their churches. Some of them dear friends, and like so well, where am I going with this? Let me try to get this back on the rails for you so I have an actual
No,
question.
I was
Go
thinking
ahead.
about religion too with the states. I mean, I think that's another area where it's burdensome. Like I was thinking that as soon as you started talking about feds, which we can circle back to feds too in a minute and federal non-enforcement, and that's certainly something I'm thinking a lot about. But I think these, if you have a model like Oregon that is only a regulated on-site use model that doesn't have the idea of like a church getting licensed as part of it, then you're like excluding a huge access point. So I think that that's burdensome, right? Like there was a huge fight with John Dennis when Oregon was um, implementing its regulations, proposing regulations, like implementing 109 to try and create a framework for churches. But churches basically were like, well, we don't want to be subject to the same storage requirements and the same dosage requirements and the same facilitation requirements and the same, like basically any of the requirements because we're a church and we want to have freedom of religion to practice. But I think that's one of the things that I am most excited about, the personal use side of Colorado and similar models that are getting proposed elsewhere, because not only are religious organizations, free to practice under the personal use community healing model side, but you actually are just taking the government out of even deciding whether a religion is sincere or not. And I love that, because I don't trust the government to decide whether a religion is a religion or not. And you kind of also take away the incentive to like pretend to be a religion, because if, just for those who may not 100% know, in Colorado under the personal use side, you can get paid for support services, harm reduction services, spiritual services, religious services, and you can share substances. So there's, whether you're a religion or not, you get treated the same, which means you don't have a motive to have a fake religion. If you want to have a therapeutic model, then my computer just then you can. And so I think that like, thinking about religious use and indigenous use when you're thinking about these state models is important. And I think the personal use side of Colorado does a good job with that. But if you want to circle back to federal, if you have that question formed, I'm happy to do that too. If you're asking, do I think the feds are going to enforce? That's, a fair question.
Well, let's start there. Like, yeah, do you think there's a risk of federal agents coming in and interfering with these state access models? Let's say
Look,
in the next year, and then maybe 10 years out, if we want to look at two different kind of time frames.
All right, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm just one person. I'm a law professor. I happen to be writing a paper right now about this like widespread federal retreat, which I allude to at the end of this article. But nothing I know or have seen or have researched makes me think that it is feasible, economically viable, politically realistic that like the feds are going to come in and enforce against state regulated, state legal activity. If they were going to do it, they would have done it. Right. And their enforcement power is just less and less and less and less. I know ICE is this like flashy, important, harmful, like real example of the federal government flexing their muscles. And when the federal government sent Marines into California, those Marines had no funding for food, no place to sleep, were sitting on the floor of an airport twiddling their thumbs. Right. So like it's scary. I don't want to like negate or diminish the fear and the real harm that's being done by federal enforcement of immigration law, or not even immigration law, just federal. These are, some of these people are here illegally, right? So that is scary and real. We haven't had, just to like name it, for adult use cannabis, there is no federal policy of non-enforcement. There used to be a Cole memo, which was a federal guidance memo that said, federal prosecutors, use your discretion wisely and don't enforce drug laws against state actors that are not giving drugs to kids and are complying with state law. In 2019 or 2018, Sessions like revoked that and said, just kidding, federal prosecutors, do what you're supposed to do. And there was a lot of fear in the cannabis industry that there was going to be a big crackdown, and it never happened, right? And more states have legalized cannabis since then. And if the federal government wanted to, if they had the resources to, if they had the desire to, if they had the real ability to, there's nothing stopping them from enforcing against all of the adult use and recreational cannabis dispensaries all over the country. On the medical side, there has been a spending amendment which says that we're not going to use federal funds to spend money against, enforcing laws against the medical side. But on the adult use side, there's nothing, right? So it's not like there's like, oh, well, there's a policy for cannabis and there's not one for state regulated psychedelics. There's no policy for either, right? So it would, especially right now, I think even more, you hesitate to say this, but I'm literally writing a whole article about this because it's like in other areas too, in environmental law and education law, in reproductive health, there's federal laws on the books and no federal enforcement at all because they've defunded and diminished our entire federal administrative state. So it's like, okay, with who's going to come do it, right? So I mean, not to, and I mean, I think especially this presidential administration and this, leader of HHS is in favor of psychedelics. So I feel like that would even, if you're out there saying, oh, we want to create access for veterans within a year, you'd be more likely to partner with states that are doing this work than you would be to like go in and arrest people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I have seen, because I've been researching this, that there have been federal agents coming into like California or Michigan to unlicensed illegal dispensaries to seize goods and arrest people, but also that's tied with ICE enforcement because there's people that are undocumented working there.
Mm. Interesting. Um, this feels like too much of a tangent. I'm going to ask it anyway. So, a thing that was happening late last year, I think like November, December, January, there was a lot of rhetoric around death penalty for drug dealers, right? And it was from the president's mouth, not very specific, right? But everybody's like, "Oh, but he really means this." I'm like, I'm uncomfortable. Like I'm uncomfortable for my friends and colleagues who may or may not be distributing, because he's not being specific that it's about like cartel drugs, meaning like fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine. But like, is that even a legal thing? Like, it's coming from the head of the country in a way, but also like that's not really a legal thing, right? Like that's I think he was trying to push states to implement death penalties. um, but do you recall that one or have any opinion on like the overall legal situation there?
Well, in terms of like the legal specificities about like the death penalty for drug crimes, right? That's like there's state by state criminal laws, which I'm not a criminal law expert, so I would defer to that. But in this other question of like, well, does it even matter what the law is to this administration? Not really, and that's scary. I mean, if we're being real, like that, like uh, could could from a top down president or agency, or it's not even, I think that what's scary is it's not even like the top down, it's like the agents themselves who like can act freely without regard for the law and then feel like there's no recourse, so it doesn't matter, like and that's what's really scary about this moment. I mean, myself, me, like I'm not sure I feel comfortable traveling internationally, right? Because at the border they could seize all my stuff, they could say, oh, you write about drugs, I'm teaching First Amendment, you write about the First Amendment, oh, you're writing about federal power, oh well, like we don't need a reason, we can just mess with you, right? So is it scary times? For sure. Is the law the basis for any of these actions? Most of them no. And that is scary. I mean, you can name that. We live in scary times. I was just saying yesterday, I wish we lived in less interesting times, you know? People are like, maybe we live in interesting times. I would take boring. I would take like, nothing in the news today. Wouldn't that be nice? Like, meanwhile, probably right now there's all these Supreme Court opinions dropping. I don't want to see what's happening. It's like it's awful. But I mean, in my own life and work, I'm trying to like open my eyes and look straight at it and say, okay, well, if this is what's happening, where are we and where could we go? And so I think that's actually pushing me not just to write about drug law, but to really expand my scope as like a writer and thinker, because there's a lot happening and it's really scary.
Yeah. Um, right. The arbitrariness of enforcement and opinions, and the legal opinion of this administration is X. I'm like, oh, what? Like, fascinating. Anyway, back to drugs. So, um,
I mean, that gets to a good topic, which is, Matt Zorn, which I'd be interested to know if you have what I mean, I know you're interviewing me, sorry, but I feel like we're just having a conversation. And
yeah, go for it.
I like Matt. I think Matt's great. I think like he was doing amazing work on the outside for the industry, helping litigate a bunch of these great cases.
He
And the
represented me temporarily.
Right. And
And yeah,
but I on one hand, I want to think, so, Matt now is the psychedelic czar in HHS. And on one hand, I want to think, oh, well, maybe he could actually do something. Again, like I generally think our federal government can't really do anything, but like in theory, I want to think he can do something. And on the other hand, I worry that they've just like plucked out one of our greatest advocates. And now he's on the inside and he can't represent anyone on the outside anymore.
right. So, like, to name like how impressive of a character he is, like he helped Sue Sicily break and end the federal monopoly on cannabis manufacture for research, was gigantic. He had a number of other important cases. Um, very bright, very sharp, very much on our side. Um, I think at one point he's like, Joe, that's not the psychedelic thing to do. I was like, okay, fine, fine, thank you, attorney. And I'm like, okay, good. And I think I'm hopeful with him in there that we're going to see some really interesting stuff. I think he's not going to be able to do everything he wants and thinks is the right thing to do, but also he's going to have a lot of influence and he's going to have a lot of power after too, which is going to be, I think, helpful in the long term. And I don't, I don't know where we're going to land with him in there, but I'm excited to have him there. Like it's, one of the most powerful legal minds that we've got in the space, and like I think that's a big fuck yeah to me. But also, yeah, is he going to be able to like say, "Oh, hey guys, like maybe stop busting those churches"? Like I don't know. We'll see. Um, and we've had a lot of conversations, he and I, about like churches and like what is the right way to do churches, wrong way to do churches, and I, I'm hopeful that he'll be an advocate for people who are doing it the right way. So this is a plug for go get multiple lawyers on your churches. Like don't just trust one. Get kind of triangulate a little bit and figure out where you want to be the safest if you're going to go the church route. That's where I live on that. I think.
I worry that it's nice to say, oh, we have this psychedelic czar, and look, he's an expert, and we can like blame things not happening on him and not really let him do anything. Again, I just don't have a lot of faith in the functioning of our federal government, but I think that if he's
Oh,
in a
that's interesting. Like
situation,
internally scapegoating him.
yeah, like, oh well, we wanted to
Interesting.
get, we appointed this guy and we wanted to get you therapy, but this guy is stopping us from doing it. Or I think he might be put in some difficult situations, and I'm happy that it's him rather than someone else. Of like, okay, I think there's this larger question of like, is it beneficial to like the nation's belief in like science to have a federal government that doesn't function the way it's supposed to? Like, in historically, a president is not able to just say, "Oh, the FDA is going to approve a drug that science didn't support approval." And you know what I mean? Like maybe we like that for psychedelics, so maybe we wouldn't like that for other things, right? Maybe that's like a slippery slope model where people like stop
Mm-hmm.
trusting the science because the science is run by politics, not by science. But he might be put in some tough situations. But I do trust that he, like I said, I'd rather be him than someone else. And I think he's a person of good character. And I think that if he's
Mm-hmm.
really put up against a wall, I could see him stepping back and then being open about it. So I mean, I
Yeah.
think it's like we'll see how it plays out. But like I said, I do feel a little like I hope that he can get things done because it's really sad that he's no longer on the outside. Because I know there was some really important work he was doing on the outside, not meaning outside of government, that he no longer can do because he's in government. And government historically, like you can't really talk about what you're doing in government while you're in government. So um,
Right. But retroactively,
retroactively, so
yeah, great
I think he'll.
stories are going to come.
Yeah, yeah, I can't wait for his tell-all book, about what it was like to work and all the crazy conversations he heard and all that stuff. And
So you made a good point about like trust in science, and I think like obviously we're having an interesting crisis here right now domestically on this, and this whole push in the last week, like we're gonna have psychedelics for veterans in
in
12
a
months.
year.
Fascinating concept. When I first saw it, I was like for active duty, and I was like, wait a second, like just doing active duty because they're government property effectively and you don't have to worry about liabilities in the same way, like that's a little bonkers and scary, but really it's I think veterans is what I've been seeing them frame it for in the last day or two. And I think
The real
I
question,
don't mm,
the real question for me is they have this article like that I read yesterday about it where it's like we're going to give them vouchers. Who's paying for that? Like where's the money coming from to like cover all of the psychedelic therapy for veterans, right? Like I don't like it's in a time when you're slashing money, you're trying to reduce workforce, you're trying to like what a what a look is that? So that's my
right.
big
And I
question mark.
think
I
there needs
also
to be like an economic analysis of like is it actually worth it, like if we're taking like a macro long term financial view, like I think the economics are such that psychedelic treatments that are done really skillfully can overall reduce the total payouts to various health treatments, but who's to
I'm not saying
say
it shouldn't be funded. I'm just saying how's it going
mm,
to be funded?
selling, I don't know, selling off the Grand Canyon and stuff, I don't know, like I I, it beats me because deficit keeps going. It doesn't seem like we're slowing spend. So like, yeah, where does it? Like, I don't know. Maybe let's not buy a few more F-35s that seem to be ridiculous, or you know,
I'm also
I'm perplexed. I don't know either.
I'm also skeptical of, and this is, look, like, you can say, oh, is this just a psychedelic thing? This is like a money plays an outside role in our policy and politics thing. But we know that there are people that have a lot of money invested in psychedelic drug development, right? And sometimes, and I see this on the cannabis side all the time, right? Like, people who have money invested in cannabis, if a new bill gets introduced that could possibly help cannabis, even if it has 0% chance of passing, oh my God, cannabis is going to be legal. Everyone, stock prices rise, investment increases, you know what I mean? Like, so I
Yeah.
also worry that, like, just like, you know, giving better care to veterans is really important. And I worry sometimes that we use veterans as a group of, like, I thought that with the around, I mean, we don't need to go all into like the FDA denial of MDMA assisted therapy, but yes, there are veterans that themselves want to stand up and say we need access. And there are other groups that use veterans as a reason to, like, push back and push forward issues that they get, like, um, you know, sort of like tokenized. Like, well,
Mm-hmm.
veterans need it. So that's why we need to push it forward. And um,
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just worry about, like, maybe RFK Jr. has some friends that have a lot invested in psychedelics. Because what if
Musk does. And like, I think, it's interesting, right? Like, Gracias's proximity to Musk is, to me, a signal that Lycos will go through really quickly. I just had a thought on the voucher thing, like, in terms of what I would love to see with the voucher thing. So we would have a few kind of credible organizations that could receive those funds, and hopefully we could create new, somewhat similar organizations that could also receive those funds and deliver those services in places like Colorado and Oregon, and now New Mexico, and hopefully Alaska. I'm thinking particularly it would be lovely if groups like Heroic Hearts could receive a lot of those federal funds, because they've had a really great track record. And I think there's always improvement, and funds can help every group improve.
I mean, I like the right now. It feels like there's, and when I teach about psychedelic law, there's still this idea that there's like three pathways. There's like the FDA pathway, there's the religious use pathway, and the state regulated pathway. Even though we know that, like, religious use happens under state regulation, and, like, there is like DEA regulated religious use through the exemption model. So like the FDA DEA model is still, like, also overlapping with the religious use model. But I think what you just mentioned, which I think would be very cool, is, and I mean, I guess, like, I guess Texas's ibogaine investment is trying to do this. Some of the proposals are trying to do this, which is to actually connect not necessarily FDA approval, but like federal funding for psychedelic access to the state programs that are already doing it, right? Like, instead of like reinventing the wheel, just saying, okay, we're going to send I was thinking this when we were talking about earlier. Let's just send a bunch of veterans to Colorado. And let them, instead of, they don't need to go to out of the country. They just go to Colorado and go to these healing centers, and that is like a pathway to access. That, like, if you told me that was the plan to get veterans psychedelic therapy within 12 months, I'm like, that's much more realistic.
And I'm into it because I live here. Like, that'll help the industry overall, right? Like, the Oregon industry was failing to a degree where people were actually doing philanthropy to businesses in Oregon, so that the model wouldn't totally fail. And it would be really lovely to see something like that. I'd like to see a few access pathways, but not just the regulated thing getting funding. But yeah, like, hopefully, like, Colorado is radically accelerating the ibogaine program, so I think there's some interesting things coming. Anyway, I know we're roughly at time, Victoria. Thank you for doing this on such short notice. Everybody, we sorted this out late last night, so it's amazing we're doing it right now. So,
well, I'm going.
Victoria, where can people find you online? Anything else you want to close with?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's like
Hmm.
I'm going on vacation next week, so I figure do this now and then go out of town. I don't know. Find me I LinkedIn, Instagram. I'm not really big on like Twitter or Blue Sky. To be honest, I'm in like a generative, creative phase right now, so I'm putting less out. I'm excited about this article. I'm like putting more, like I said, big picture, federal, state power stuff out soon. But I am excited that people have been receptive to this article. I think, especially if you're someone in a state where you think that your state might actually be down, and I mean, I'm going to think about it in Rhode Island, might actually be down to pass it. Like, I think simple piece of legislation. We are going to create a new license type under our cannabis regulatory agency where we would license cultivators for mushrooms. They could get tested through the same testing channels if that's what you have. They could be, similar regulations as we have for cannabis, and then they get sold at a cannabis dispensary. If you want to make it a medical model, I mean, this goes back to your like Rick Doblin pilot license, whatever model. Like, if we want to make it a medical thing, sort of like Allison's New York permit model, where you have to have a qualifying condition and do like some video program to help qualify you to use mushrooms, then I could see that happening. But this feels like the path of least resistance. And it's a way to go to your state and say, we can make you money, right? Like, you're hurting for money. The investment to just have a new license type. I know some of the statutes limit, like you might have to pass a statute that amends your cannabis law to add a new substance. I'm not saying it would just be like that. But if you go to a state and say, here's a way you don't have to invest that much money, you can make a bunch of money. I think that's the biggest thing right now. States are hurting. People need money and people need access to mushrooms. So to me, it feels like a good match. And so I'll be excited, especially to talk to anyone about that. And yeah, Joe, it was fun to catch up with you. I had a little bit of JOMO with psychedelic science because it just isn't quite my scene. Joy of missing out. But there are some people that I really love to have this kind of conversation. And so I am grateful that you invited me and that we could make it work. And I hope we'll do it again.
Yeah, we will. I hope so. And final bit of trivia: I almost moved to Rhode Island instead of Colorado, but I would have been with you in the fight there. But glad you're on the ground doing it. All right, Victoria, thank you so much, and until next time.